If you love emotional storytelling, make sure you hit the subscribe button.
I'm afraid I have some bad news.
What happened?
Is he okay?
Because this is just the beginning of a journey you won't forget. Part 2. The diagnosis came on a Wednesday afternoon, and it came like a thief in the night. Unexpected, unwelcome, and carrying with it the kind of certainty that made all their carefully constructed happiness feel suddenly fragile. Adaeze was in the hospital waiting room when the doctor called Min-Jun's name. She watched her husband stand and follow the doctor into an office, and something in the air shifted. It was a small thing, barely noticeable, but she felt it in her bones. The way you feel the approaching storm before the sky changes color. She'd known something was wrong for weeks. Min-Jun had been losing weight, experiencing fatigue that sleep couldn't fix, suffering from headaches that no medication seemed to touch. But they'd both been so focused on the gallery, on building their life together, on finally proving that their choices had been right, that they'd ignored the warning signs. Now, sitting in a hospital waiting room in Seoul, surrounded by people speaking in Korean, Adaeze felt the walls of her carefully constructed world begin to shake. 20 minutes later, Min-Jun emerged from the doctor's office, and his face told her everything before his words did. Leukemia, he said quietly, sitting down next to her. Acute myeloid leukemia. The doctor says it's treatable, but it's aggressive. I'll need chemotherapy. Multiple rounds. The survival rate is good, but... He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Adaeze's hands were shaking so badly, she could barely hold his. She thought about all the times she'd been afraid in her life. The fear of disappointing her parents, the fear of poverty, the fear of making the wrong choice by coming to Korea. But none of that fear compared to said, and her voice sounded like it belonged to someone else, someone stronger, someone who actually believed the words she was speaking. We'll go through the treatments, and we'll come out the other side, and we'll keep building our life. We've already survived the impossible. We can survive this too. Min-Jun took her hand and pressed it to his chest, over his heart. I'm terrified, he admitted. Not of dying. I've made peace with the idea that I might die. I'm terrified of what this is going to do to you. I'm terrified that you're going to have to watch me get worse before I get better. I'm terrified that you came to Korea for a love story, and you're going to get a tragedy instead. No, she said firmly, and she meant it with every fiber of her being. I came to Korea for you. Not for a love story. For you. And that means I stay through the tragedy. That means I'm here for the hard part. That means I choose you, Min-Jun, just like I chose you in that airport, just like I choose you every single day. The chemotherapy started 2 weeks later, and it was nothing like what Adaeze had imagined. She'd imagined hospital rooms and machines and doctors in white coats. But she hadn't imagined the way the chemicals would ravage Min-Jun's body, turning him into something fragile and broken. She hadn't imagined the way his hair would fall out in chunks, the way his skin would become translucent, the way his eyes would lose their light. She hadn't imagined how hard it would be to watch someone you love be destroyed in the name of saving them. The apartment became a second hospital. Adaeze set up a schedule, appointments and medications and blood tests and follow-up visits. She went to the gallery less and less, finally taking a leave of absence to focus entirely on caring for Min-Jun. The money they'd saved started to disappear faster than they'd anticipated. The experimental treatment that the oncologist had recommended wasn't covered by insurance, and it cost more than they could afford. It was during one of these late nights, while Min-Jun was sleeping fitfully in their bedroom, that Adaeze received the call. It was his mother. How is he? Min-Jun's mother asked without preamble. He's... Adaeze paused, trying to find a word that could encompass the reality of her husband's situation. He's fighting. The first round of chemo was hard. The doctor wants to try an experimental treatment, but we can't afford it. There was silence on the other end of the line. How much? His mother asked. $50,000, Adaeze said quietly. For the initial treatment. Potentially more if he needs multiple rounds. That's nothing, his mother said, and Adaeze could hear the sound of her shuffling papers, her mind already moving into problem-solving mode. I'll have the funds transferred tomorrow. But Adaeze, listen to me. Min-Jun is going to get worse before he gets better. He's going to be angry and scared and desperate. And he's going to question whether this is worth it, whether living like this is worth the cost. When that happens, you need to be stronger than both of you. I don't know if I can do that, Adaeze admitted. You can, his mother said, and her voice was firm. Because you're the one who convinced him that love was worth losing everything. Now you have to convince him that his life is worth fighting for. That's the cost of that choice, Adaeze. That's what comes after the fairy tale. She was right. The second round of chemotherapy was worse than the first. Min-Jun became almost unrecognizable, not just physically, but emotionally. The pain medication made him sometimes lucid and sometimes confused. The exhaustion made him bitter. The reality of what he was going through made him question everything. One night, around 3 a.m., he grabbed Adaeze's hand with surprising strength. I don't want to do this anymore, he said, and his voice was clear in a way it hadn't been in weeks. I don't want to do this anymore, he said, and his voice was clear in a way it hadn't been in weeks. I don't want to keep fighting.
I'm tired, Adaeze.
I'm so tired, and I just wanted to stop. Her heart stopped. Min-Jun, she began. Listen to me, he interrupted.
I've been thinking about this.
About us. About the choices we made. And I think I made a mistake. I think I was selfish when I chose you over my family, over my life, over stability. And now I'm sick, and we don't have money, and you're destroying yourself trying to keep me alive. I've ruined both our lives. Adaeze felt tears streaming down her face, but she forced herself to stay calm, to stay present. Do you regret me? She asked quietly.
No, he said.
That's what makes this worse. I don't regret you. I regret everything else, but not you. And that means I have to keep fighting, even though I don't want to. And I hate that. I hate that you're making me want to live when dying would be easier. She climbed into bed next to him, careful not to jostle his 4 lines, and held him while he cried. Then hate me, she said. Hate me for not letting you give up. Hate me for being stubborn and refusing to accept that you're going to leave me. Hate me if it helps you keep fighting. But don't leave me, Min-Jun. Please don't leave me. I didn't come 6,000 miles to lose you now. The turning point came unexpectedly. It was during the 5th round of chemotherapy, and Min-Jun's blood work came back showing that the cancer cells were decreasing. The experimental treatment was working. His body was fighting back. He was going to survive. The relief was so overwhelming that both of them collapsed when the doctor delivered the news. Adaeze held Min-Jun while he cried, and she realized that she'd been holding her breath for so long that she'd almost forgotten how to exhale. But even as the good news settled into their bones, something had shifted between them. The experience of almost losing him had changed.
Min-Jun.
It had made him realize that life, even a life lived in poverty and uncertainty, was worth living if he was living it with Adaeze. But it had also made him realize something else, something he needed to confront. One evening, as they sat on their apartment balcony watching Seoul's lights flicker below them, he turned to her with an intensity that she hadn't seen in months. I need to see my mother, he said. Adaeze stiffened. Min-Jun. Not to go back to the company, he continued quickly. Not to ask for forgiveness or to try to rebuild the bridges I burned. But to tell her thank you. To tell her that without her help, without the money she gave us, I would have died. And I need her to know that I'm grateful. Even if I'm not grateful for the way she tried to control my life, I'm grateful that she loved me enough to help me live. It was a reasonable request. But Adaeze felt a spike of fear anyway. What if she tries to use that as leverage? She asked. What if she tries to convince you that you owe her something? What if she tries to convince you to come back to the company, now that you're recovering? She won't, Min-Jun said calmly. Because I'll tell her no. I've learned something through all of this, Adaeze. I've learned that I can say no. That saying no doesn't make me ungrateful. It just makes me honest. The meeting happened at a cafe in Gangnam, neutral territory that belonged to neither of them. Min-Jun's mother barely recognized her son. The cancer had aged him, had changed him, had stripped away the last vestiges of the privileged corporate heir he'd once been. What remained was something more essential, a man who had looked death in the eye and decided to live anyway. You look like your father, his mother said, and her voice was thick with emotion. I look like someone who almost died, Min-Jun corrected gently. And I'm here because I need to thank you. I need you to know that without your help, without the money, I wouldn't be here. I would be dead. And even though our relationship is complicated, and even though I don't regret the choices I made to get away from you, I regret that I couldn't say thank you sooner. His mother reached across the table and took his hand. I'm proud of you, she said quietly. I know I've never said that before. I know I only ever told you what you were doing wrong, what you needed to improve, what you were failing at. But I'm proud of you. For choosing love. For fighting to live. For being brave enough to be different. Min-Jun was crying, and Adaeze, watching from a distance, felt her heart fracture and mend simultaneously. The months that followed were about rebuilding. Min-Jun's hair grew back slowly, and they joked about how much gray was mixed into the black now. His strength returned gradually, and he started working at the gallery again, though only part-time. He was different now, quieter, more thoughtful, less driven by the need to prove something to himself or to the world. Adaeze resumed her painting, but her work had changed too. The colors were darker now, more complex. She painted the experience of almost losing someone, the fear and the love, and the way that surviving a crisis together either destroyed a relationship or made it unbreakably strong. But there was a shadow that hung over them both, even as they celebrated his recovery. It started with nightmares. Min-Jun would wake in the middle of the night, gasping, convinced that the cancer had returned, that the remission was temporary, that he was going to die anyway. Then there were the scans, the constant surveillance of his body, looking for signs of return. The anxiety that came with each appointment, the relief that came with clean results, the knowledge that he would have to do this again in 3 months and 3 months after that, for the rest of his life. Adaeze understood cancer in a way that people who hadn't lived through it couldn't. It wasn't just a disease. It was a specter that haunted every moment, reminding them that life was temporary, that love was fragile, that everything could change in an instant. It was during one of these moments of anxiety, about 6 months after Min-Jun's diagnosis, that the letter arrived. It was from a lawyer in Nigeria. Adaeze's father had suffered a stroke. He was still alive, but he was partially paralyzed and would need intensive care. Her mother was falling apart. Her younger brother couldn't handle the financial burden alone. They needed her. She was needed in Nigeria. The realization hit her like a physical blow. For 3 years, since that moment in the airport in Seoul, she had been living in a bubble with Min-Jun. The rest of the world had faded into the background. Her family had existed as voices on phone calls, as people she'd left behind, as the life she'd chosen to abandon in order to be with him. But they were still there. And now they were suffering. And there was a very real possibility that her father might not survive his stroke, that she might never get to apologize to him for lying to him, for running away, for choosing a stranger over her family. She didn't tell Min-Jun immediately. She sat with the letter for 2 days, letting it sit on the kitchen table like an accusation, like a reminder that love couldn't exist in a vacuum, that there were other people in the world who needed her, that her choices had affected more than just herself and her husband. When she finally told him, his first reaction wasn't anger or sadness. It was understanding. "You have to go," he said without hesitation. "No," Adaeze said immediately. "I'm not leaving you. Not after everything we've been through. Not when you're still recovering. Not when." "You have to go," he repeated, and this time there was firmness in his voice. "Your father might be dying, Adaeze. You need to be there. You need to see him. You need to tell him that you love him before it's too late." "And what about? About us?" she demanded. "What happens when I leave?" Min-Jun was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was careful, measured, like he was trying to choose the exact right words. "I think," he said slowly, "that we've been so focused on surviving our love story that we've forgotten that love isn't just about 2 people. Love is also about responsibility. Love is also about honoring the people who came before us, who made us who we are. Your father made you who you are, Adaeze. And right now, he needs you." "So you're telling me to leave," she said, and she could feel the panic rising in her chest. "No," he said, and he pulled her close. "I'm telling you that I love you enough to let you go. I'm telling you that I survived cancer, which means I can survive you being in Nigeria for a while. I'm telling you that if we're strong enough to make it through what we've made it through, we're strong enough to survive time and distance and family obligations." "What if I can't come back?" she whispered. "What if my father dies and my family tries to keep me there? What if they convince me to stay?" "Then I'll come find you," he said. "Like I found you before. Across 6,000 miles, across every obstacle, across everything that was supposed to keep us apart. I'll find you again." The flight to Nigeria felt like a funeral procession. Adaeze sat in her seat, looking out at the clouds below, and tried to convince herself that this was temporary, that she was just going for a few weeks, that she would come back to Min-Jun and their apartment and the life they'd built together. But in her heart, she knew that something fundamental had shifted. Her father was lying in a bed in their family home when she arrived, and the sight of him stopped her in her tracks. He looked smaller than she remembered, more fragile, more human. The stroke had affected his left side, and one of his eyes was slightly closed, giving him an asymmetrical expression that was deeply unsettling to witness. When he saw her, something flickered in his functional eye, not anger, not disappointment, but recognition. Pure recognition, like he was seeing his daughter for the first time in a very long time. "Adaeze," he said, and his speech was slurred, affected by the stroke, but his intention was clear. He was trying to welcome her home. She collapsed into a chair next to his bed and cried in a way she hadn't cried since she was a child. The next weeks were a blur of doctor's appointments, of learning to help her father with basic functions, of watching her mother come apart and having to be the strong one for a change. It was the inverse of her life in Korea. Instead of being supported, she was doing the supporting. Instead of being the one who was loved and cherished, she was the one who had to do the loving. And it changed her. It reminded her of who she was before Seoul. It reminded her of the responsibilities that came with being a daughter, being a family member, being part of a community. It reminded her that love wasn't just about romantic passion. It was also about duty, about showing up, about being present for people even when it was hard. But the longer she stayed, the more she felt the pull of her old life. The pressure to stay, to take care of her father indefinitely, to abandon the career she'd built in Korea, to become the responsible daughter who would never leave again. Her mother began suggesting that she stay, that she could open a gallery in Lagos, that she could have a comfortable life if she just accepted her family's support, if she just came back home where she belonged. And Adaeze felt herself being pulled in two directions, toward her past and toward her future, toward her family and toward her husband, toward safety and toward passion. It was during the 4th week of her stay, while she was sitting with her father in the early morning light, that he tried to speak to her about Min-Jun. "You love him, her." Her father managed to say, the words coming out fractured but clear. "Yes," Adaeze admitted. "You made the right choice," he continued. "Coming here to see me is important. But staying here would be wrong. Love like that is rare. Don't lose it." Tears streamed down Adaeze's face. "I don't know how to do both," she said. "I don't know how to be a good daughter and a good wife. I don't know how to honor you and honor him. I don't know how to take care of you and take care of myself." Her father reached out with his functional hand and squeezed hers. "You're doing both," he said. "By coming here. By being here now. By showing him that you love your family. That is how you honor both of us." The conversation with Min-Jun that night was the hardest they'd had since he'd gotten sick. "I need to go back," she said, and her voice was steady because she'd made a decision and she wasn't going to second-guess it. "I've needed to come here and see my father. I've needed to be with my family. But staying here isn't the answer." "Are you sure?" Min-Jun asked, and she could hear the relief in his voice, but also the concern. "Because your mother has been calling me. She's been telling me that your family needs you. She's been suggesting that maybe you should stay, that your father's recovery is going to take a long time, that you have responsibilities." "I do have responsibilities," Adaeze said. "But my father told me something today. He told me that the best way to honor our family is to build my own life. He told me that loving you is not a betrayal of them. He told me that I need to go back to Korea. When?
Min-Jun asked.
As soon as possible, she said. I'll stay another week to make sure my father's care is in place, but then I'm coming home. I'm coming back to you. There was something like joy in that moment, the moment when she said home and meant Korea, meant the apartment, meant Min-Jun. It was a realization that she'd never expected to have, but it felt absolutely true. The week felt like a year compressed into 7 days. Adaeze spent every moment with her father, helping him with his recovery exercises, talking about their years together, about her art, about Min-Jun, about the life she was building. And her father, in his slow, slurred way, helped her understand something fundamental. Fear, he said one afternoon, makes us control. Your mother fears losing you, so she tries to make you stay. I feared losing you, so I tried to make you obey. But love is different. Love, let's go. On her last night in Lagos, her mother came to her room. I don't want you to leave, her mother said without preamble. I want you to stay. I want to go back to having my daughter close by. I want to not be afraid all the time. I know, Adaeze said, and she held her mother. But you have to let me build my life. You have to let me love him. You have to trust that I'm strong enough to do both. Her mother cried, and Adaeze cried with her, and in that moment, something shifted in their relationship. Her mother was no longer trying to control her. She was just trying to understand her. Be happy, her mother whispered. That's all I want. Just be happy. The return to Korea felt like a homecoming in a way that returning to Nigeria never had. Min-Jun was waiting for her at the airport, and when she saw him, she realized how much he'd recovered. He was strong now, healthy, solid. The cancer seemed like a distant nightmare, something that had happened to someone else. They held each other in the middle of the terminal, and people flowed around them like water around a stone, and Adaeze felt something settle in her chest, a sense of rightness, of being exactly where she was supposed to be.
Welcome home, Min-Jun whispered.
But home, it turned out, was more complicated than she'd realized. Because the time apart had created space between them. Not romantic space, but real space. They had both changed during her absence. Min-Jun had made important decisions about his career, about his health, about his future. Adaeze had reconnected with her family in a way that had reminded her of who she was before Seoul, before him. The reintegration wasn't seamless. They'd wake up and realize they were strangers in some fundamental way. They'd have conversations that felt stilted and careful. They'd reached the point where passion had to transform into something deeper and more complex. It was while they were struggling with this transition that the second crisis hit. Min-Jun's doctor called with results from his 6-month scan. The cancer was returning. Not in a major way, not yet, but the markers were showing a possible relapse. The words felt like falling. They'd been so close to being done with this, so close to being able to move forward, so close to being able to pretend that the cancer was just a chapter that was closed. And now the chapter was reopening. This time, Min-Jun didn't fall apart. Instead, he became very quiet, very still. I can't do this again, he said one night, and his voice was hollow. I can't do another round of chemotherapy. I can't spend another year of my life fighting. I can't ask you to stand by me through another battle. You're not asking me to do anything, Adaeze said fiercely. I'm choosing to be here. I'm choosing to fight with you. I'm choosing this. But what's the point, he asked. What if it comes back again? What if we spend the next 10 years playing this game, in remission, then relapse, then remission, then relapse? What kind of life is that? It's a life, Adaeze said simply. It's our life. And it's worth living. But even as she said it, she wasn't sure she believed it. Because this time it felt different. This time, the cancer felt like an enemy that wasn't going to be defeated, just managed, just endured, just survived until survival became too difficult. The experimental treatment that had worked the first time wasn't as effective. The second time, the cancer was more aggressive, more resistant. The doctors were honest, the survival rate was lower this time. The odds were worse. And Min-Jun had to make a choice. Undergo another grueling round of chemotherapy with uncertain results, or stop treatment and focus on quality of life instead of quantity. He chose to fight. But something in him had changed. The determination had been replaced by resignation, by a sense of going through the motions because stopping felt like giving up. It was during this second battle that Adaeze discovered something that would change everything. She was cleaning out a drawer in their apartment, a drawer that had belonged to Min-Jun's previous apartment, one that they'd never quite gotten around to organizing, when she found a stack of letters. They were written in Korean, sealed, addressed to M, written in a handwriting she recognized. They were from Min-Jun's father. After his death, his papers had been distributed, and somehow these letters, written over years, addressed to his son, meant to guide him through life even though his father wouldn't be there to see him grow, had ended up in a drawer. There were dozens of them. Some were dated for specific occasions, for his 18th birthday, for his college graduation, for when he would turn 30, for when he would fall in love, for when he would face impossible choices. She translated them slowly, carefully, with the help of a translator app, though she understood enough Korean now to catch the emotional core of what his father was saying. One letter in particular stopped her cold. It was dated for when you are sick, when you are afraid, when you think that fighting is not worth it anymore. In it, Min-Jun's father wrote about loss, about losing Min-Jun's mother's love when he'd been too focused on work, about losing friendships because he was too committed to the company, about losing pieces of himself because he was trying to be everything to everyone. But he also wrote about learning that the only thing that actually mattered was the people you loved. The only legacy worth leaving was the example of a life lived fully, even if it was brief. If I could tell you one thing, the letter concluded, it would be this: your life is not measured in years. It's measured in moments of genuine connection, in times when you chose love over fear, in instances when you were brave enough to be vulnerable. If you live for 100 years without those moments, you'll have lived a half-life. If you live for one day with those moments, you'll have lived fully. Choose fully, my son. Choose love. Choose courage. Choose to live, not just exist. When Adaeze read those words, she understood something fundamental about Min-Jun. She understood that somewhere inside him, he already knew that surviving his father's death meant he had to live fully. That everything he'd done since then, choosing her, leaving the company, choosing passion over safety, had all been an attempt to honor his father's memory by actually living instead of just existing. She showed him the letters. He read them in silence, his face moving through expressions of shock and sorrow and recognition. When he finished, he was crying. He knew, Min-Jun said. He knew that I would struggle with this. He knew that I would reach a point where I questioned whether living was worth the cost.
And he told me anyway.
He told me to choose fully. So, what are you choosing? Adaeze asked gently. Min-Jun looked at her, and in his eyes she saw the answer before he spoke it. I'm choosing life, he said. Not because I think I'll definitely survive. Not because the odds are good. But because I'd rather live fully for whatever time I have left than survive indefinitely by existing instead of living. The second round of treatment was harder than the first, but Min-Jun endured it differently. He didn't fight the cancer with anger or desperation. Instead, he seemed to be making peace with the possibility of death while simultaneously choosing life. It was a paradox that Adaeze didn't fully understand until she realized that he wasn't fighting cancer anymore. He was fighting for the life he wanted to live, the life with her, the gallery, the art, the moments of genuine connection that his father had written about. The cancer was just the circumstance. The real battle was against fear. And slowly, miraculously, the cancer began to retreat again. The markers improved. The scans showed reduction. The doctors became cautiously optimistic. And after 4 more months of treatment, Min-Jun rang the bell at the cancer center that signified the end of chemotherapy. They allowed patients to ring it when they finished treatment, a ritual of survival and hope. He rang it so hard that the sound echoed through the entire hospital floor. A year later, when the doctors declared Min-Jun in complete remission, they allowed themselves to finally breathe. It was a cautious breath. They both knew that remission wasn't the same as cure, that the cancer could return, that they would be living with surveillance and anxiety for the rest of their lives. But it was a breath nonetheless. It was a moment of peace, however temporary. Adaeze created a painting to mark the occasion. It was her largest work yet, a massive canvas that showed a figure emerging from darkness into light. But the darkness wasn't disappearing. It was becoming part of the light, integrated into it, transformed by it. The painting sold to a major collector for more money than she'd ever made before. The success of the painting led to gallery representation in Seoul, in Tokyo, and Hong Kong. Her work was finally getting the recognition it deserved. And Min-Jun left the small gallery where he'd been working and opened his own space, a place dedicated to emerging artists, a place that was part gallery and part sanctuary, where artists could create and exist without the pressure of commercial success. They were finally building the life they dreamed of. The love story that had begun in an airport was transforming into something deeper, a partnership, a friendship, a shared commitment to creating beauty and meaning in a world that often felt like it was conspiring to prevent both. But there was a shadow that neither of them could quite shake. The fear that it would all be taken away. The knowledge that health was temporary. The awareness that every moment was a gift that could be revoked at any time. It was this shadow that made Min-Jun suggest something radical one evening as they were sitting on their apartment balcony, watching Seoul's lights shimmer below them. "Let's get married," he said. Adaeze turned to him in surprise.
We've talked about this.
"You said you wanted to wait until..." "Until what?" he interrupted gently. "Until we were sure? Until the cancer was definitely gone? Until he could guarantee that everything would work out?" He took her hand. "I've learned that there are no guarantees," he continued. "I've learned that certainty is a luxury we can't afford. And I've realized that I don't want to spend even one more day of my life not being officially, legally, ceremonially bound to you. I don't want to take the risk that something could separate us without us having made that commitment permanent." "That's an interesting way to propose," Adaeze said, laughing through tears. "I'm not trying to be romantic," Min-Jun said. "I'm trying to be honest. I want to marry you because I love you, but also because I'm terrified of losing you, and making it official feels like a way to hold on to you more firmly." "That's actually kind of romantic," Adaeze said. The wedding was small and intimate, held in a chapel in Seoul with both families present. Min-Jun's mother cried the entire ceremony. Adaze's parents flew in from Lagos, her father moving more slowly now but completely present, completely aware, completely supportive of the union that had caused him so much consternation years before. When the priest asked if anyone objected to the union, Min-Jun's mother actually stood up and started clapping, which broke the tension and made everyone laugh. As they exchanged vows, Adaeze realized that marriage wasn't the end of their love story. It was just the beginning of a new chapter. A chapter where the passion would hopefully transform into something more sustainable, something that could survive cancer and separation and fear and the thousand other things that life threw at you. They'd survived the impossible. They'd fought for their love against family, against circumstance, against disease. And now they were choosing to do it officially, legally, permanently. It felt like a relief. 6 months after the wedding, Adaeze became pregnant. It was unexpected. They talked about possibly having children, but they'd never committed to it. The cancer had made them both uncertain about the future, and bringing a child into a world where one parent might get sick again felt like it carried enormous moral weight. But the pregnancy happened, and they had to make a choice. They chose life. Adaze's pregnancy was healthy, joyful. She continued painting through the first 2 trimesters, creating work that was suffused with a sense of hope and anticipation. Her art was finally reflecting not just struggle and survival, but also joy and creation and the possibility of something new being born into the world. Min-Jun became obsessive about preparing, reading parenting books, attending birth classes, documenting the pregnancy in photographs, and writing. The man who had been so afraid of the future was suddenly completely invested in building one. And when their daughter was born, a girl they named Zara, meaning blossoming flower in both Korean and Yoruba traditions, something shifted in both of them. The fear didn't disappear. If anything, having a child made the fear more acute. Now there was someone else's life to protect, someone else's future to consider, someone else's happiness that depended on both of them surviving, on both of them staying healthy, on both of them continuing to choose each other even when it was hard. But underneath the fear was something bigger. Hope. Hope that their daughter would grow up in a world where love mattered more than money, where passion was valued over safety, where choosing yourself and your partner was seen as an act of courage rather than selfishness. It was on Zara's first birthday that the cancer returned. This time, the markers didn't come with warning. Min-Jun started feeling tired again, started getting headaches again, and they both knew before the tests came back what was happening. When the doctor confirmed it, Min-Jun didn't cry. He just sat very still, holding their daughter, and seemed to be making a calculation in his head about what his life was going to look like from this point forward. 3 rounds of treatment this time, the doctor said carefully. More aggressive. The survival rate is lower than before. But you've survived it twice already. Your body knows how to fight this. That night, after Zara was asleep, Min-Jun and Adaeze sat in their living room and talked about the reality of their situation. I need you to listen to me, Min-Jun said. And I need you to really hear what I'm saying. If at some point this becomes too much, if at some point you need to leave, I want you to do that. I want you to take Zara and build a life somewhere else. I don't want you to sacrifice your daughter's childhood to my illness. That's not going to happen, Adaeze said firmly. You can't know that, Min-Jun replied. You can't know what you're capable of enduring until you're actually enduring it. So, I want you to promise me something. I want you to promise that if it gets to be too much, you'll make the choice that's best for Zara, even if that means leaving me. Adaeze wanted to argue, wanted to insist that she would never leave, that they would survive this together like they'd survived everything else. But she'd learned enough about life to know that sometimes promises made in moments of crisis aren't ones you can keep. I promise, she said quietly, that I'll do what's best for Zara. But I also promise that I'll try everything in my power to make sure that what's best for Zara includes having both of her parents. The third diagnosis was the hardest to process because now there was a child involved. Now there were moments when Adaeze found herself thinking about life without Min-Jun, not out of wanting to leave him, but out of a desperate attempt to prepare herself for a possibility she couldn't control. She imagined herself as a widow. She imagined raising Zara alone. She imagined trying to explain to her daughter why her father had gotten sick, why she couldn't save him, why love wasn't enough to prevent death. And those imaginings were almost worse than the cancer itself. The treatment was brutal. After 2 cycles, Min-Jun's body was breaking down in ways that it hadn't during the previous rounds. The doctors were frank. His body was reaching its limit. 1 more round might kill him faster than the cancer would. They gave Min-Jun a choice. Stop treatment now, and focus on making the most of the time he had left. Or continue and risk that the final round of chemotherapy would damage his body beyond repair. How much time, he asked the doctor. Without treatment? Maybe 6 months. Maybe a year if you're lucky. With the final round of treatment, we don't know. Could be longer. Could be much shorter. Min-Jun looked at Adaeze, at Zara, who was sleeping in the corner of the hospital room. His daughter had just turned 1. She would have no memories of him. She would grow up knowing her father only through photographs and stories and the genetic inheritance of his features. I want the final round, he said.
Min-Jun, Adaeze begin.
I want the final round, he repeated, looking at her directly. Because if there's even a possibility that I can see my daughter grow up, that I can be there for her childhood, that I can watch her become a person, I have to take it. Even if the odds are bad. Even if the treatment might kill me. I have to take that chance. And Adaeze realized in that moment that she'd married someone braver than she could ever hope to be. The final round of chemotherapy took 3 months. By the end of it, Min-Jun was barely recognizable, reduced to a skeleton wrapped in skin, barely able to hold his daughter, barely able to walk across the apartment without assistance, but the cancer was retreating. The doctors were shocked. They'd expected this round to be devastating, to push his body over the edge. Instead, his body was fighting back one more time, refusing to give up even when giving up would have been easier, and slowly, against all odds, he began to recover. It took months. It took physical therapy and careful nutrition and the kind of slow, grinding determination that only comes from someone who has looked death in the eye multiple times and decided that living was worth the cost. But by the time Zara's second birthday came around, Min-Jun was strong enough to walk her to the park, to push her on the swings, to teach her how to identify colors in Korean and English and Yoruba. The doctors called him a miracle. His family called him a survivor. But Adaeze knew the truth. He was just a person who loved fiercely enough and had been loved fiercely enough to keep fighting even when fighting seemed impossible. 5 years later, Min-Jun was still in remission. His health was fragile. He would always be vulnerable to relapse, would always have to endure regular scans and medical surveillance, would always be living with the knowledge that his future was uncertain, but he was alive. And more importantly, he was present. He was there for Zara's first day of school. He was there to teach her about art, about Korean culture, about the importance of choosing passion over safety. He was there to hold Adaeze when she cried about her father's latest health setback, to support her through the grief of watching her father age, to be the person she'd chosen to have at her side through all of life's disasters and triumphs. And Adaeze had become the artist she'd always dreamed of being. Her work was showing in galleries around the world. Her paintings, which told the story of survival and love and the complexity of building a life with someone, were resonating with audiences everywhere. She'd created a series called The Spaces Between, which had become her most celebrated work. Each painting in the series represented a different moment in her journey with Min-Jun. The moment they met in the airport, the moment she got the news about his cancer, the moment she returned from Nigeria, the moment she realized she was pregnant, the moment she rang the chemo bell with him. But there was one painting that had remained unsold. It was the final painting in the series, and it was titled Still Standing. It showed two figures, a man and a woman, standing together as a storm raged around them. They weren't fighting the storm. They were just standing together, waiting for it to pass. And in the background, barely visible, were the outlines of a child and the suggestion of a future beyond the storm. Adaeze refused to sell that painting. It was the only one from the series that she wanted to keep, because it represented something that she'd learned through all the crisis and struggle and fear, that love wasn't about fairy tales or happily ever afters. Love was about showing up every single day. Love was about choosing someone, choosing them again and again and again, even when it would be easier to leave. On a quiet evening in their Seoul apartment, with Zara asleep in her bedroom and the city lights flickering below them, Adaeze asked Min-Jun the question she'd been wanting to ask for years. Do you regret it? Any of it? Coming back from the company? Choosing me? Going through the cancer? Getting married? Having a child? Min-Jun was quiet for a long moment. Then he took her hand and placed it over his heart, just like he'd done in a hospital room years before. I regret that I was afraid, he said finally. I regret that I let my mother control me for so long. I regret the years I spent not being myself. But the cancer? The struggle? You? Our daughter? No. I don't regret any of that, because I lived through all of it. I actually lived, Adaeze. And that's worth everything. She leaned her head on his shoulder, and they sat together in the darkness, two people from opposite sides of the world who had found each other across 6,000 miles and had chosen, again and again, to keep choosing each other no matter what came. The cancer might return. Life might throw other disasters at them. The future would always be uncertain, always be terrifying, always be one step away from disintegration. But they would face it together. And that made all the difference. If you love emotional storytelling, make sure you hit the subscribe button, because this is just the beginning of a journey you won't forget. Stay hooked for more captivating stories.